This inventor has been called a one-man environmental disaster for inventing both leaded gasoline and the chemicals that created the ozone hole. His name was Thomas Midgley Jr., and it took many years for his invention's impact to be fully understood. The ozone hole alone could have put millions of lives at risk by allowing more harmful UV radiation to pass through directly to our skin. Imagine getting a sunburn in like 5 minutes. That is the future that we actually avoided. And we actually did that through science-based international collaboration. I believe that story is a hopeful one that we can solve the climate crisis. This is a 3-ish part series about that story. It all starts with refrigeration. You see, early refrigeration was powered by flammable, toxic, or even explosive gases like ammonia. And in the 1920s, household refrigeration was coming on the scene. One refrigerant in particular was really efficient and therefore really good for those smaller household uses. It was called chloromethane, and it was toxic. Thank you to the Internet Archive, which allows us to look at this consumer report from 1936 that said in less than 1 year, there were 29 deaths in Chicago alone from poisoning caused by defective methyl chloride, another name for it, refrigeration systems. People apparently were so worried they were leaving their fridges outside. So it's no surprise the industry was looking for a non-toxic solution to refrigeration. In comes Frigidaire. It used to be a subsidiary of General Motors. Yes, this General Motors. Well, Frigidaire had been showing losses for years, and they wanted to be the ones to solve this problem. And that's where Thomas Midgley comes back into the picture. He was tasked to lead the team to find a solution. And they did. They collaborated with DuPont, yes, that DuPont, and they created a non-flammable and non-toxic refrigerant. And they called it Freon, which is a term you probably are familiar with. Apparently this guy was a showman, and in 1930, in a public demonstration, he inhaled some of the Freon and blew out a candle with it to show it was both non-flammable and non-toxic, which I think is a pretty good flex. Now, if you hear DuPont, that probably should give you a little bit of concern, right? Okay, so Freon is actually one of many different chemicals called chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons. And this is great. They found the replacement. That's awesome. They even found that these chemicals had great uses and other things as a propellant for aerosols. They used them in fire extinguishers, hairsprays, all sorts of stuff that was like sprayable, even asthma inhalers. So then why did Time magazine put this on their list of 50 of the worst inventions alongside Crocs, Clippy, New Coke, DDT, and yes, leaded gas, another one of Thomas Midgley's inventions? Well, many years later we'll find out that this new chemical, though safer for humans directly, ended up creating a problem for humans on an atmospheric level. I'll see you tomorrow to talk more about ozone. There are only 3 treaties that the whole world has officially agreed on, and they all have to do with the environment. The first 2 have to do with ozone depletion. You see, ozone is like a shield. It protects us from the most harmful UV radiation. That radiation is damaging to DNA. We're talking skin cancer, sunburns, not to mention crop damage. And in the 70s and 80s, we were figuring out that millions of lives could be at risk because of the depletion of ozone. The 70s and 80s was a huge time for hairspray, and unfortunately was causing a huge hole in the ozone layer. Okay, it's actually a thinning of the ozone layer, not technically a hole. Now, in the last video, we talked about how toxic refrigerant gases were replaced by CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, which were non-toxic, which sounded great. They're also being used as propellants in hairsprays, fire extinguishers, as coolants in ACs, and by the 1970s, 1 million metric tons of the stuff was being produced. But then scientists started looking into it, and in 1974 at UC Irvine, Dr. Mario Molina and Professor Sherwood Warland discovered that CFCs are so stable they can go all the way in the atmosphere, where those same UV rays could break off elemental chlorine, which would react and destroy ozone. Furthermore, CFCs could last for like 50 to 100 years in the atmosphere, so the sooner we acted, the better. This actually mobilized the public really quickly, and people started throwing out their aerosol products. But of course, industry wanted to fight back. And if you remember DuPont, yes, DuPont, which made the first CFC, which we talked about in the last video, they fought back especially hard. The chair of the board of DuPont was saying that the ozone depletion theory is science fiction and a load of rubbish, utter nonsense. But scientists, environmental groups, and the public continue to fight. And in the late 70s, the Clean Air Act included ozone protections. Enter this guy. He accelerated ozone protections. Just kidding, he's Reagan. When Reagan took office, he didn't make CFCs a priority. Talks stalled and production actually rebounded. And then the NRDC sued the EPA and unstuck progress. In 1985, a key discovery was made that raised alarm bells for lawmakers and the public alike. Research scientists at the Halley Base Station in Antarctica discovered that there was a thinning of the ozone layer above Antarctica by about 40%. So indeed, the hunches that those earlier scientists had was having real impacts on the ozone layer already. Scientists at NASA, led by Susan Solomon, sealed the relationship between CFCs and the ozone hole. And soon countries were agreeing to create an international framework to deal with CFCs, the Vienna Convention. That framework was used to create the Montreal Protocol, which was created and led by Dr. Mustafa Kemal Tolba, an Egyptian scientist who was leading the UN environmental program at that time. The Montreal Protocol was ratified in 1987 and is widely revered as a major accomplishment of international collaboration. It's been ratified by 198 parties, the maximum amount. It sets a mandatory timetable for phasing out ozone-depleting substances. It even recognized that different countries have a different responsibility to protect and manage the global commons, and provided a $1 billion fund to help developing countries transition away from CFCs. The EPA has estimated that in the US alone, we have prevented over 150 million cases of skin cancer for people currently alive and born by the year 2075, and prevented over 3 million deaths. And there's a climate change bonus. CFCs are a greenhouse gas. Replacing them has slowed climate change by about a decade. We're currently on track, and the ozone layer is expected to recover over a number of years. And remember that atmospheric lifetime means that CFCs are still in the atmosphere. So even though we stopped producing CFCs in 1992, there is kind of a lag. NASA has this cool visualizer. You can look at the daily updates on how the ozone hole is doing if you are curious about that. Okay, last video I said this was a 3-part story, and yes, we're not done yet. We have some questions to answer, like, were the replacements for CFCs 100% safe? Spoiler, no, they weren't, and we actually need to phase those out as well. And what lessons can we derive from the success story? I'll see you next time in the final episode of this series. I don't read as much as I'd like to, but there's one climate book I actually read cover to cover, and it's Project Drawdown. It came out in 2017, but it is very comprehensive and still extremely relevant. It ranks solutions to climate change by the total amount of greenhouse gases they can potentially avoid or remove from the atmosphere. And the number one solution they list is refrigeration management, which I was surprised about when I first read this. Now, it might not be surprising to you because we've been talking about refrigerants for a few videos now. This is the third and final video about how we created the ozone hole with refrigerants and then fixed that problem through international collaboration, which I think is a really good story about how we can solve climate change. But it turns out the story's not over yet. Now, we are well on our way to patching the ozone hole because of the UN's Montreal Protocol, which was ratified by all of the states that were allowed to vote, which was a groundbreaking protocol. So early refrigeration used to use toxic gases for refrigerants, and we replaced it with a non-toxic gas, CFCs, fluorofluorocarbons, and those are the things we had to ban because they ended up depleting the ozone layer. But as you know, refrigeration management is still number one on that climate solutions list, and that's because we replaced CFCs with hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, and those things are also big greenhouse gases. Now, why did this happen? Remember, the problem we were trying to solve is that the ozone layer was depleting, and that could lead to millions of people being exposed to extra radiation, which would cause cataracts, skin cancer, all sorts of really bad health things. So we were optimizing for fixing the ozone hole, and the fix was HFCs. Well, the fix was to replace CFCs, and much of CFCs were replaced by HFCs. Very quick sidebar that all greenhouse gases are not created equal. Some of them are stronger than others because they absorb heat better, and they may also absorb them over a longer period of time because they can last in the atmosphere for longer. So we use a metric called the global warming potential to say how bad greenhouse gas is. In this chart, let's just look at the left and the right here, which is the first column is the chemical, and on the right side is sort of the latest update about what the IPCC says. About what the IPCC says is the global warming potential for each. The other thing you need to know is that carbon dioxide has a global warming potential of 1 because it's the baseline. So it's the smallest thing on here, which you see right above here. Of course, CO2 is an extremely important greenhouse gas because it is largely driving climate change, and that's just because the amount of CO2 that's out there. So you can have small amounts of a greenhouse gas that is very strong and have a big impact, and that's what we see with CFCs, which we controlled by the Montreal Protocol. You're seeing values in the thousands over here. Enter those HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons. We're also seeing values of in the thousands, high hundreds. So those are hundreds or thousands of times more warming than CO2. So that's why refrigeration management is number one, because we need to replace these HFCs as well, and we are going to do it. We're already planning to. As early as 2009, delegates from North America, as well as the Federated States of Micronesia and Mauritius, were proposing an amendment to the Montreal Protocol, which is called the Kigali Amendment, and that is to phase out HFCs and replace them with less harmful alternatives, which turn out to be CO2, ammonia, and hydrocarbons. But we're looking at a difference again of a global warming potential of 1 versus thousands. And we actually did it in 2016. The Kigali Amendment was added to the Montreal Protocol. The amendment will phase down HFCs by 85% worldwide. Scientists say it will have a massive climate impact and prevent 0.5 degree Celsius increase by 2100, which is about 0.9 degrees Fahrenheit. Trump's administration even supported it in 2017, and Congress actually ratified it in 2022 with bipartisan support. I won't go too much into this, but it had business benefits to Trump, which is something that is very interesting to explore. But basically, if all other countries are phasing down HFCs and we aren't, it makes us less competitive on the global market, and so that's part of why people think, that's why he supported it. Okay, so that was a doozy. I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned. Yes, chemicals are messy, and replacing one chemical with another doesn't solve everything. I sort of have 5 takeaways from the story. The first being that science is a conversation and a ever-sharpening of understanding, and we see that scientists continue to learn and call things out and create international pressure. 2, that international pressure does work. We see that the international community rallied around protecting the ozone layer. And then again, with HFCs. And that support even happened under slower presidents who were less focused on climate. Third, that pressure really works when you focus on human health, and that's why you see the very scary impact of the ozone layer was big enough. I would argue, bigger and more sharp than the threat of climate change, and that immediate danger to human health made a big difference here. Fourth, that businesses will respond to a narrative of a competitive edge in these situations, and you saw that here with the Kigali Amendment, something to think about in this next administration. And lastly, we have this great blueprint now, the Montreal Protocol, which shows that international collaboration is very possible, and that you can also recognize differentiated responsibilities for different countries in something global like climate change. And so, as I told you in the beginning, I believe that we can solve climate change with international collaboration. The ozone story helps us to see that it was possible, and we have done it before. We actually have tried to do something similar, the Kyoto Protocol, with climate change, which was not as successful, and I haven't delved into that, but I think we will do a later series about that. But for now, I'd love to have your support to subscribe, find me on YouTube, if you're seeing me from TikTok, and let's keep learning and talking about climate change. All right, have a great 2025.